Good morning, happy afternoon, and pleasant evening, everyone. I hope you didn't miss me yesterday, but I was sick. I still kind of am today, but however, today we have to go over something we have left in the dark for a few weeks, actually, which is Mythic Plus. We have completely ignored the activity for a while, and for good reason, you know. If nothing interesting is happening, there is really no reason to report on it every week. But now it's been long enough, we have gotten a good enough amount of changes and new things worth talking about over this time period that we can go over it again. The newer thing to talk about that is going to be touching the biggest and the largest amount of the player base is the fact that we are currently sitting comfortably on the easiest week of the season. I have constantly nagged you on about this for weeks and weeks, about the fact that we did not know for Season 2 which of the combination of affixes we would get every week. The new cycle of affixes was unknown and Blizzard was releasing it every time we would get into a new reset. This was up until last week. Last week was Tyrannical, Bolstering and Explosive, and it was the 12th and last week of the cycle. So from this week, we already knew it would have been Fortified, Bursting and Storming, which is also the easiest of the weeks. This is of course also highlighted by how much easier it is to push certain keys. The last video we made, we congratulated a new world first plus 28 key being completed, and that was in Bolstering, Tyrannical and Explosive. So with this new set of affixes, in just a couple of days we now have a dozen more plus 28 keys being completed, right? So it is a very good moment for you if you want to push some keys, if you want to get to higher score, higher rank than you currently have. If you were looking, for example, at playing some alts and the whole items being locked, Valor upgrades, for example, being locked behind certain rating was also holding down your other characters. This is a good way, this is a good week to get that rating up because the keys are very lenient, they are very easy to time, compared to several other weeks. Now, to be perfectly honest, next week is not too terrible either. There is going to be Tyrannical, Raging and Volcanic, so it's not awful, but still, this week is certainly very, very good for you if you want to push your keys in Mythic Plus. As you have learned by now from my teachings, the easiest thing, or rather the more important thing when it comes to getting into the keys of Mythic Plus, when you want to look at unknowing affixes, is how much time are they going to make you lose? How many of these affixes are going to force you to spend more time on the mobs than you otherwise wouldn't have spent? Affixes like Bolstering are going to force you to spend more time simply because the affix is going to give more HP to the mobs, which means the keys are going to go slower. Affixes like Necrotic are going to force you to kite, which means it's going to make the key more slow. Even to some degree, affixes like Spiteful, where some kiting, even not just from the tank, but from everyone, is going to be required, or situations with things like Raging or Inspiring, which might also slow your key. But this week, you have Bursting and Storming. Storming has been nerfed pretty much into irrelevance. At this point, Storming is not really that big of a threat at all, and Bursting is also quite manageable. There aren't too many dungeons and too many situations in the dungeons where Bursting can grow to very, very dangerous levels, plus it's dispellable now, it's been for a while. It's not as much of a nightmare as it was in BFA, so it's much more easy, and it's fortified, which means bosses are not going to take 6 years to kill. So it's a very comfortable week. Most of the dungeons are going to be pretty comfortable to complete. It's also one of these weeks where you can start legitimately skipping some of the mini bosses and get their debuff in the last boss. So Oros Cold Dart, for example, giving you the 50% slow, or Sogodon giving you the 50% more physical damage taken are very, very good in many fights where either A, the movement is not going to be that required, or B, the vast majority of the damage you're going to be taking from the last boss is magical, meaning you won't really care if you're taking 50% more physical damage, plus, of course, it's fortified, which means the bosses are not going to be more threatening because they are tyrannical. And skipping those mini bosses is, of course, going to allow you to skip even more time. So very, very good week for pushing, either for you, for your alts, as well as it has to do with rating, getting to Keystone Master, for example, getting to a rating high enough to be able to unlock Valor upgrades, whichever that may be, maybe even getting to the plus 20 level to get the teleports. Either way, this is the easiest week you're gonna get for a while to be able to push high keys. Now, about the actual players, the actual human beings being in these keys and playing the different specs. How has it been going in this last month or so? This might be some useful information for everyone. Maybe you just like stats, you just like to see how the situation between specs and classes and the balance is. Maybe you just like looking at graphs and colorful bars, or perhaps you're looking at which specs to play for 9.1.5 or 9.2, whichever that may be. You're just trying to look at which specs seems nice to you, and this might help you, of course, particularly if your focus would be Mythic Plus. The main change we have gotten compared from a month or so ago is that Prot Paladins are more prevalent. I don't think this has to do with a very high level Paladin, Prot Paladin being the one to get the very high keys being cleared. I don't think so many people have suddenly started playing Prot because of that. It has just gotten more popular over time. The main tank still being used in the higher keys, anywhere from 15 and up, and then a little bit more in the plus 20 and up is still Guardian Druid, followed by Vengeance Demon Hunter. The main change, however, is that Prot Paladin is gaining more ground over time. When it comes to healers, he's also somewhat similar, also kind of surprising, but Holy Paladin has lost representation a little bit more than expected. They are now below Resto Shamans in keys higher than 20, and there has been a more relevant growth by Mistweaver Monks. I know some people are going to look at this and laugh because they will see 5.5% and they're like, you must be joking, it's not really that big of a growth, but still, if previously they had been just chilling between 3.5 and 3.9%, and now they are at 5.5, it is, a massive increase in representation. Same goes for Holy Paladin. Yes, they are still super popular. However, they lost almost 15% representation over the course of a month when it comes to high keys. It might mean something. Also, the other thing worth mentioning is that Holy Priest has finally definitely overtaken Discipline Priest. The last time we left that they were very close to each other, but still Discipline was kind of edging ahead, and now Holy Priest has grown by 40% compared to before, which of course might simply mean that more Discipline Priests went to play Holy, but still it's a pretty impressive growth for Holy Priests as well. And even Restoration Druids grew over time. So pretty much the underplayed specs, Holy Priest, Mistweaver Monk, and Restoration Druid have all grown by quite a bit compared, to their small numbers. The growth was still impressive, and the more popular one, which was Holy Paladin, dropped a lot in representation. Resto Shaman is still Resto Shaman. It's still just chilling there, almost completely unchanged. The melee and the ranged DPS, however, have gotten much less to talk about compared to the tanks and the healers. The more important, I guess, changes are related to the fights within the same class. Warriors, for example, we have gotten Arms Warrior getting more, I guess, up ahead compared to Fury, and at the same time we have gotten a massive loss, an over 40% loss of representation of Outlaw Rogues in favor of Subtlety. Now Subtlety is getting more and more represented even in Mythic Plus, not just in raids where both Sub and Assassination are way more popular than Outlaw, but even in Mythic Plus itself. And this is, a very important change, because Outlaw has traditionally been the king of Mythic Plus, if not just for the entirety of the role, if not just for the entirety of the melee DPS, even just within Rogues, it was the spec to go for ever since Legion, and it remained unchanged for a long time. Now, actually, Subtlety is up and against Outlaw, and seems like they are prone to beating him, definitely, especially when it comes to MDI level and super high key level quality. It's just Subtlety over Outlaw. The other relevant change when it comes to ranged is, of course, the heavier and continued growth of Beast Mastery Hunter, which has gotten much closer to marksmanship, even when looking at the plus 15 level, which we haven't looked too much because the numbers are so large. For example, in this case, well over 400,000 instances of players. The numbers are so large that seeing significant changes is very rare. Even in that case, you can see that Beast Mastery is now super close to marksmanship. And then the other slightly noticeable thing yet very easy to predict was that Fire Mage is now also much more popular. They are now in the middle at 8.7% representation. They have increased by over 50% the representation since the last time we checked. Of course, we also documented their growth in red encounters, so it was only natural they would have followed up in their increase in popularity in Mythic Plus as well. So going back to where we started, the situation at hand looks like quite promising, at least when it comes to tanks. It is still, of course, when you go to the higher keys, you will always see one tank generally be more prevalent than the others, of course. But the situation is definitely better than it has been in recent years when it comes to the spread of viable tanks. You know, when we just go, instead of looking at just at this season, we just look at the entirety of the expansion plus even the entirety of the end of BFA, you look how the colors have started to get more spread compared to before. You know, the start of Shadowlands looked like it was going to be a repeat of BFA, except the color brown was changed with the color purple. So instead of the dominance of Prot Warrior, we had the dominance of Vengeance and nothing else changed. The numbers were still very tiny. Basically, Brewmaster Monk was still reasonably popular just because of the way they work, but then one major spec would take over. But then after quite a few, honestly, nerfs to Vengeance and buffs to the other tanks, we see now that the situation is more even, much more even than it has been in a while, so definite good result when it comes to tanks. You know, for healers, okay, for healers is not as good, not too good of a situation. We see that very predictably when we look at all of the keys of this season and how it's been going so far. At the lower level, it looks normal. It looks normal because players clearing +2 or +5 or even +10 keys are not particularly focusing on Mythic Plus, and you can see, for example, that Resto Druid is very popular, and so is Priest as a whole. And then, of course, as soon as you start getting closer and closer to the +20 level, you get to see who is getting more popular there. So as pretty much the opposite of tanks, healers are the ones that did remain with something similar to what they had in BFA. As you see, BFA was the realm of Restoration Druid, just like it was Legion, to be fair. And then you had Shadowlands, where basically Paladin took the spot, took the role of Restoration Druid. You could still say it is slightly more balanced simply because Restoration Shaman is putting up a pretty decent fight to Holy Paladin this expansion compared to before, but it's definitely not as varied and diverse as the tank situation. The only surprise when it comes to the melee DPS, as we talked about briefly, about the sort of change in hierarchy within the rogues, with subtlety becoming more and more prevalent. The only change historically for the melee DPS is that now Havoc is basically splitting time with Windwalker, and not much else has changed. You can look, basically, all of the colors are almost a complete and seamless transition from BFA to Shadowlands. The warrior representation, the enhancement representation, the survival hunter that you can't even see, the red paladin, and the rogue as a whole is basically the same from one expansion to the next. The only thing that changed is towards the end of BFA, when people thought Unholy was going to be OP, and then the release of Shadowlands where Unholy was OP, getting good representation for DKs, but then it quickly went back to normal. Havoc got taken over by Windwalker. Havoc was then buffed in Season 2 in 9.1, and you can see that Havoc got way more representation over time, but the vast majority of the situation has remained the same. So if you were thinking about what to play in 9.1.5, perhaps 9.2, looking at certain specs to play, this gives you a good idea. At the very least, historically, in the past few patches, few major patches, which of the specs and classes are generally going to be popular in Mythic Plus. It also does show you when it comes to higher levels, even though if you are someone aiming at higher Mythic Plus level keys, you probably know this already. The fact that Havoc, for how much better they are doing this season and how much more popular they have been compared to the start of Shadowlands, they are still not that represented at the higher keys. They are losing out to both Rogue and Windwalker when you look at the higher level of keys. And then lastly, you have the Ranged DPS. The Ranged DPS do also have somewhat of a similar transition from BFA to Shadowlands. You had Shadow Priest as well as basically the entirety of Warlocks maintaining more or less their niche spot in the meta, and so did Elemental for a long time. The only class, what a surprise, that continues to be very popular overall was Mage. From BFA to Shadowlands, pretty much a seamless transition. We then had sort of like a switcheroo. In BFA, it was just Hunter and basically no balanced druids, and then at the start of Shadowlands, it was a split. A very even split between Hunters and Druids. Eventually, Druids became more and more powerful, and Hunters became more and more outscaled, to the point that now Balanced Druids have taken over the spot as the more popular and the more represented Ranged DPS spec, not just in Mythic Plus, but in raids as well. The only other thing worth noting for the Ranged DPS is Elemental. Of course, if you were thinking about, giving a try to Elemental, it is a much more volatile type of spec. As you can see, this is pretty much the first time in a while where Elemental is legitimately a good contender, a good decent spec for high keys compared to before in a while. So it's not like picking Mage, you're not as safe, for example, if you're picking Elemental Shaman, but for the moment, for the time being, it is definitely a very strong spec in Mythic Plus. It is also comforting when you look at the representation of Elemental Shamans that pretty much their popularity doesn't even change. From doing a +3 to doing a +23, the number of Elemental Shamans stays the same, which bodes well, because it means the spec itself is not very popular between all of the facets of players, whether or not they do +5 in the spare time or +10s or +15s, but the high end of the spec, so the top end of the spec, is performing very well, high enough to be decently represented at high keys. One of the few rare changes outside of all of this was something that we touched a month ago more or less, which was wondering if Discipline Priests going over to Mechanicos and being able to play with Boon of the Ascended with a very heavily reduced cooldown, upwards to 1 minute cooldown on the ability instead of 3, they would have been able to push out more damage or competitive/comparable damage to a Holy Paladin, and if whether or not Restoration Shamans would have been able to do the same by going Kyrian and changing their legendary as well. Now, we have seen over the last month, since the last time we did this, that Restoration Shaman did actually do that. Restoration Shaman did go in their performance in Mythic Plus to now be at the level of a Holy Paladin, as opposed to where they were before, which was at the level of a Discipline Priest. This is mostly what happened, the change that happened. The majority of the higher, better performing top level Kyrian, top level Restoration Shamans have now gone Kyrian to play in Mythic Plus, and they are now playing with an offensive legendary. Pretty much 97.22% of Shamans doing high keys is playing with an offensive legendary, and most of them, because they are Kyrian, they are also playing with Raging Vesper Vortex. This allows them much increased damage when it comes to AoE packs, which is very important in Mythic Plus. The AoE you're able to do, it is much more reliable than the extra AoE you can pull out if you were playing with the Earthquake legendary on your Earth Elemental. This is much more effective to use as a Resto Shaman, so it allows them a much more smooth and heavier AoE DPS for keys, which is very important. DPS for healers is very, very important, not just because it makes you clear the key faster, but also because I know it might not make too much sense at first, but the higher you go in keys, the higher the key is, the less you have to heal, because the more things are going to simply straight up one-shot you, so they won't be anything left to heal for you. And the higher the key, the better the players, the less players are going to get hit by avoidable damage requiring to be healed. So less healing is going to translate into leaving more time for your healer to do more damage. So it is also very important to be able to have good ways to do damage the higher you go in the key, because of how much more free time you're going to have for yourself to be able to do damage as a healer. Now, with this, we can close the video pointing out that we are kind of getting towards the start of the MDI. Just now, just in this weekend, we have been getting through the last stand, so the phase 3 of this season of the MDI. We already have 7 teams qualified, 2 qualified from Group A, 2 qualified from Group B, 2 qualified from Group C, for both NA and EU, and 1 team qualified from China. With this last tournament, you will get the 8th team to qualify. So after that, we will be able to start going through what's happening in the MDI, which specs are being used, etc, etc, etc. So for now, with this Mythic Plus update, we can stop here. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, myself and my Red Ant colony, you can like the video, leave a comment down below and subscribe to the channel. Thank you anyways, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, my neck. I woke up and my neck was so stiff. I looked like an LFR player trying to dodge a mechanic. Oh my god.